All right. So, hello, good evening to one and all. I'm Ananya Acharya, the chairperson of Commercium, the Society of Commerce of St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. Commercium has been established on the sesquicentennial celebrations of our college, and within the span of 2 years, we have been able to reach out to more than 2,000 minds varying different professions and ages, discussing issues in and around the world of commerce. Today, we'll be discussing India's tryst with central planning, a virtual campus talk part of the Indian Liberals Project, an initiative by the Center for Civil Society and the Frederick Norman Foundation for Freedom. To talk about CCS and the Indian Liberals Project, I would like to call upon Mr. Anas Khan, the Project Associate from Center for Civil Society.
Thank you very much, Ananya, and good evening, everyone. As Ananya rightly pointed out, this virtual campus talk is part of the Indian Liberals Project, which is a joint initiative by the Center for Civil Society and the Frederick Norman Foundation for Freedom. The Center for Civil Society is a public policy think tank based out of New Delhi. We work primarily on education, livelihood, and policy training, and we do many student programs, our flagship being the I policy for young leaders. Now it is the E policy for young leaders, and we do many sessions pertaining to public policy and policy training for students and young professionals. And the Indian Liberal Project primarily is an online, it's an archive of Indian liberal tradition, wherein you will find on the website www.indianliberals.in many periodicals, magazines, audio and video resources tracing back the Indian liberal tradition and the work of various scholars and thinkers who have spearheaded the liberal and the classical liberal movement in India. So I request all of you to check out the website. It might help you for research about this as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so good evening, everyone. I'm Robin Francis, the creative side of the Commerce Society of St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. I request everyone to keep their videos and audios turned off.
On the stage. Hey, that's Robin. That's Robin.
Who's Robin?
Guys, please keep your videos and audios turned off. Yeah. So the speaker for today's session is Dr. Rajeshwari Sengupta. Dr. Rajeshwari Sengupta is an assistant professor of economics at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, that is IGIDR in Mumbai. In the past, she has held research positions at the IFMR Business School, Chennai, the Reserve Bank of India, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Her main areas of interest include international finance, open economy macroeconomics, monetary economics, banking, firm financing, and financial markets. She was a member of the Research Secretariat for the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee that drafted the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, that is IBC 2016 for India. She obtained a PhD in economics from the University of California, Santa Cruz. She holds 2 previous degrees in economics from India, that is a bachelor's degree from Presidency College, Calcutta, and a master's from Delhi School of Economics. So before we start with the session, a few instructions for the participants. So again, participants are requested to keep their videos and audios turned off throughout the session. Also, we'll be circulating a Slido link during the session for the Q&A. Only the questions entered in Slido will be accepted. So ma'am will be answering your questions throughout the session. Hence, send in your questions live as we discuss, and do like the questions you want to be answered first. Also, please note, we'll be circulating a feedback form 10 minutes before we end the session, and ECC points will only be given to those who fill this feedback form. So yeah, that's it. So without any further delay, let us start with the session. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thanks for the kind introduction. And I'd also request all participants to please mute their audio and video, because otherwise it creates a lot of noise and that disturbs the talk. So I'm just going to share my screen now so that you all can see the presentation. So the talk today is going to be on India's experience with central planning. And as Robin mentioned, that I will be taking questions throughout the talk and not at the end of the talk only. So please type in your questions in Slido as and when you come up with any doubts, clarifications, questions. I'll stop about after every 10-15 minutes and I'll take some of the questions. So let's get started. So if we look around at the world around us, it seems as if in India we have embraced capitalism quite wholeheartedly. We hear of government selling off previously nationalized companies. We see that multinational companies are everywhere. Some of you would probably be looking for jobs in multinational companies as and when you graduate. We are increasingly connected in a global economy. Of course, we're living in a day and age of information technology, never more so than now. As a result of this lockdown, we've all got a crash course in digitization and even more enhanced use of information technology. And new prospects and opportunities are opening up everywhere. So in this slide, you will see a lot of brand names and you'll be familiar with many of them. When I was growing up, when I was in school, for example, I barely knew any of them because they were just not there in India. But now, of course, you are very familiar with brands like Infosys, with Google, with TCS, Wipro, IBM, and the entire bandwagon. Now, the two important things to note about this is that this only conveys a partial picture of the Indian economy as we see it today. And secondly, more importantly, it wasn't always like this. This whole notion of India as what we think it's a market economy, it's a capitalist economy, is very new. For 4 out of 7 decades since independence, the balance, in fact, was tilted in favor of the state. And throughout the presentation, I'll use the word state to primarily mean the government, the overall government of the country, of any country for that matter. India was a centrally planned economy for majority of the time since independence. What I'm going to do in today's talk is I'm going to talk about 6 big issues. One is what is meant by central planning, very briefly. Then I'll spend some time talking about the historical context in which India adopted central planning. After that, I will talk about the experience of planning in India. Then why does central planning fail, or why did central planning fail specifically? The new central planning in India, and finally I'll end with an alternative framework. So let's get started with what is meant by the word central planning. The way I look at it, central planning means it's a system where the government gives direction on any element of production technology. The government decides how to produce any good and service and what to produce. The government essentially picks winners, and that's a very, very important phrase. Essentially, the government decides, let's say, who gets allocated land, who gets to set up a factory, who gets to produce what commodity, how much, who gets to export, who gets to sell in the domestic market. Every element of the production technology gets decided by the government. The government decides which technology is to be used. As I said, which location is used is good. And finally, the holy grail of market economics, which is the price mechanism. The government even decides which price is good. Okay, so every element of the production technology of the economy gets decided by the government. That is called a system of central planning. It's a centralized planned system, which of course is, as you can understand, intricately connected with the concept of socialism, with the concept of domination of the state. And here, what I've shown you is commanding heights. Now, this phrase commanding heights famously was used by Vladimir Lenin in Russia to mean that the founding pillars of any economy, the so-called heavy industries, steel, cement, fertilizers, or transportation, without which no economy can function, these are referred to as the commanding heights of an economy. And central planning means that the government will control the commanding heights of the economy. Now let's go on to the historical context. It's very important to understand that when India adopted central planning, what was going on in the world, because India, of course, was not operating in isolation. Throughout most of the history, the state has been dominant, the state has been ascendant, extending its domain further into what has been the territory of the market. So for majority of the 20th century, if we look at it, the state actually has been a very, very important player in any economy. The victories of the state were triggered by the 2 world wars and the Great Depression. And the main conviction was that free markets would go into excess, they would readily fail, and there was a great potential for free markets to abuse the system. And hence the government or the state was free from all of these problems. And as a result, the state has been ascended for majority of the period in the 20th century. Now, this picture here, if I were in a physical classroom, so to speak, with you guys, I would ask you what this picture conveys to you, but I can't do that now. Essentially, this is a picture of the Great Depression in the United States. What you see here is called a soup line, where thousands of Americans would line up every day in order to get some free food. Here you see there's some free coffee and donuts for the unemployed. So the Great Depression of the 1929 that hit the UK and the US was a very, very severe shock to the countries. It's perhaps still date the most severe shock, notwithstanding the current pandemic. The world economy was collapsing, and in the context of the Great Depression, US President Franklin Roosevelt, he decided that the market system had failed. In fact, the interpretation of the Great Depression was that it was a failure of the market system that prevailed in the pre-Great Depression era in the United States. As a result, what Roosevelt did was that he created a plethora of new agencies and organizations in order to regulate banks, and stock market, and capitalism itself. Okay, so that basically paved the way for decades of state domination in various aspects of our economic lives. The industry in the US was subject to a host of new rules and regulations. And world over, not just in the US, in most of the developed countries, the state started playing an extremely important role in regulating and in controlling the economy. So this was playing on against the context of a very important intellectual battle. Somebody has scribbled something on the screen. I'm not sure what's going on here, but anyways. This was going on against a very important intellectual battle, which was between the two great stalwarts of economics of the time. If you can recognize, on the left, you have John Maynard Keynes, a very famous British economist. And on the right, you have Friedrich von Hayek, another very famous Austrian economist. What was the intellectual battle that was going on? John Maynard Keynes was of the opinion that market economy would go into excess, left to itself. It would not work in difficult times, and the government would have to step in. And he, of course, was talking about the Great Depression, that when the economy is collapsing at that point of time, you cannot rely on the free market to do any kind of repair or resolution. You need the government to step in to fix the economy in those times. On the other hand, what Hayek would say is that the market would eventually take care of itself. And this was completely contrary to what John Maynard Keynes believed in. So that's why I said these two economists were essentially on two ends of the intellectual battle that was going on in the world at that point of time. However, for decades till 1970s, the ideas of Keynes dominated the economies of the Western world. So Keynes was clearly on the winning side because, as I said, starting with Franklin Roosevelt in the US, leaders in almost all the countries who were affected by the Great Depression decided that the government needs to step in a very big way to save the economies from further economic collapse. And of course, right after that, we had the Second World War from 1939 to 1944. And what happened was that with the Second World War, Keynesianism, the phrase Keynesianism essentially means the importance of government intervention to revive growth in an economy. So with the Second World War, the Keynesianism became government policy. So what the US government did was it pumped in a huge amount of money in the Second World War effort. It lent large sums of money to the British government, as a result of which, because the US government was spending money, there was a rise in demand in the US economy because the US economy was producing all kinds of war-related equipment, trucks and uniforms and whatever is required in the war in gigantic quantities. That led to a boost in demand in the US economy. As a result, the unemployment that was created by the Great Depression nearly ended and the depression disappeared. So that, of course, was like a success of Keynesianism, so to speak, because Keynes had said that the government needs to step in to revive growth, and that's exactly what happened. So the combination of Roosevelt's policy and Keynesianism together almost paved the way for several decades of government intervention in economic lives. And what that meant was that governments everywhere became fat cats, right? You had really large governments in almost all developed countries. The government became big, the bureaucracies became big and complex. The government started spending a lot of money, taxing a lot of money. So the whole state apparatus, whole government machinery became a fat cat. In 1944, which was at the end of the Second World War, Friedrich von Hayek wrote a very famous book called The Road to Serfdom, in which he mentioned that too much government planning means too much government power, and too much government power over the economy destroys freedom and makes men slaves. So this sort of summarizes how strongly Hayek was against what was going on. And he could realize that 1944 onwards, once the Second World War has come to an end, all the countries, all the developed countries of the world were automatically moving towards socialism in some form or the other, was automatically moving towards more government power, more government intervention. And that was completely antithetical to what he stood for. And therefore, he wrote a book very strongly saying that this was not correct, because we must let the competitive system work itself out. And if that means that you have unemployment for some period of time, you just have to put up with it. But at no point, at no cost, should you sacrifice freedom, should you sacrifice individual freedom, because that's extremely important for an economy to work in the long run. But what Keynes replied was that, the second quote is by John Maynard Keynes. He said that, very famously, he said, in the long run, we are all dead. In the long run, if you allow things to go on without remedy, and he was referring to, if you allow free markets to go on like this, if you allow the whole capitalism to go on like this, then we get lots of Hitlers, lots of wars, and lots of Stalins. So what he was referring to is the fact that because of Germany's misery and collapse after the Great Depression, that actually had given encouragement to the Nazi Party and to the Hitler to rise to prominence. So that's what he was referring to, that if you just let things go on like this, we get lots of Hitlers and lots of Stalins, Stalin in Russia. What we want is not no planning or even less planning. We almost certainly want more. And that itself gives a very good snapshot of what was going to happen in the world economy for the next 3 decades or so. That you're going to have planning, you're going to have a lot of government intervention, and the state is going to play a very dominant role in almost all economies. So before I move on, because I'm just going to do maybe, a couple more slides and then take questions. So most people would have agreed with Keynes when he wrote this to Hayek. At that point of time, as I said, the overall mood in the world, when you're coming out of a Great Depression and you're coming out of a Second World War, the economies of the world are absolutely battered. Everybody's looking for direction, and everybody automatically moved towards the state, moved towards socialism in some form or the other. An extreme form was communism in Russia, and in more moderate form was some kind of a socialist economies in the Western world. So in the battle of ideas, Hayek was on the losing side. Jeffrey Sachs, another very important economist, said that at the end of the Second World War, there was a tremendous loss of faith in the market economy. The centrally planned economies of Lenin and Stalin and socialism were in ascendancy. Capitalism and free markets were in retreat the world over. These pictures, if you can recognize, there is Vladimir Lenin on the left-hand side, and there's Joseph Stalin on the right-hand side. These are the two most important architects of central planning in the Russian economy. And Russia sort of paved the way for central planning. So we are going from a time where socialism was becoming important. People were realizing the importance of government, importance of state. And then you had the extreme of central planning, which was propagated by Russia. And these two were the most important architects of central planning. In Great Britain, around this time, the dominant intellectual tradition was called Fabian socialism. And the reason I have mentioned this here is we'll come back to this when we talk about India. The general feeling in Great Britain under the Labour Party was that, and the Labour Party is the party that won the election after the Second World War in 1945. So the general feeling was that the Fabian socialism, or socialism in general, is better than allowing a lot of gamblers to run the world, where they're not interested in us, but only in profit. And the Labour Party was almost entirely Fabian in ideology. So the whole idea was that We don't want a lot of gamblers, the so-called capitalists, the free marketeers to run the world because they're just interested in profit. So we want a socialistic kind of an economy where there is social justice along with economic growth. So very briefly on one slide on what was the Fabian Society. So let me just stop once and ask Anas if there are any questions at this point of time. Anas?
Yes, we do have some questions. Would you like to answer them?
Sure.
Yeah, so the first question that we have, and it has been upvoted by two people as well, is do you think the earliest adoption of capitalism would have helped us?
The earliest adoption or earlier adoption?
The earlier adoption. I mean, the question
Okay.
would mean that, yeah.
Okay. So I'm guessing when the person have asked the question means helped us, you mean India. And because if it refers to India, I'm just going to postpone the question for the later part of the talk when I come to India, because I will be addressing the question at that point of time. So let's park that for now. I will address this. Let's move on to the next question.
Sure. The next question that we have, wasn't socialism the wisdom of the age back then? And why was it that?
Absolutely. In fact, that's exactly what I'm talking about right now, that it was indeed the wisdom of the age. And as I've been explaining, that when you come out of two big shocks in terms of the Great Depression and the Second World War, everywhere in the world, the mood was that socialism or some form of government intervention was the answer to economic misery. And that if you left it to the free market, if you left it to the private corporate sector, they would only be interested in profit, and they would not be interested in building the economies or reconstructing the countries. Because you have to remember that all these countries, talk about Britain, talk about France, they were completely battered by the Second World War. So when the task is about reconstructing the economies and building the economies and to basically strengthen the economies, then everybody looked towards the government, everybody looked towards the state in order to accomplish the task. And of course, this was hugely encouraged by the intellectual thinkers of the day and age, primarily by John Maynard Keynes, who played a very influential role at that point of time. And he was a big believer in the role of the government, in the role of the state. So overall, the mood at that point of time was one of socialism. And you had Russia on one hand, who was adopting central planning. We have to remember that Russia had won the Second World War, and that was a huge victory. So here is a victor of the biggest war of the century, and that victor has adopted central planning and has given the state and the government so much of an importance. Of course, a large number of countries had no option but to look up to Russia and think that maybe that was a successful economic model. And on the West, you have Britain, which is what I'm talking about right now, that even in Great Britain, today we think of Britain as like the champion of capitalism, but back then, the Labour Party that had won the election in Great Britain was a big believer in Fabian socialism. And that's just what their ideological viewpoint was. So world over, there was a mood that socialism is what was needed. And that's exactly the context in which India became independent. Next question.
The next question is that did Keynesianism not decrease global inequality? Wasn't it there to repair capitalist damage?
So say that again. Did Keynesianism not do what to equality?
Did it not decrease global inequality?
That's a very, very big statement. That's a very big claim. There is no evidence as such that Keynesianism would lead to a reduction in inequality. What Keynesianism essentially says is that when there is a crisis, when there is a problem, the government needs to step in and the government needs to intervene in order to spend more so that growth is revived. So now, we should not misinterpret Keynesianism as immediately implying socialism. That's not what Keynes was talking about. What Keynes was talking about is that when you are in an economic crisis like the Great Depression, the government needs to spend its way out of the crisis. So that is what is called a fiscal stimulus in modern economics. So the government needs to provide stimulus, the government needs to spend, create demand and jobs, and that's the only way the economy will come out of the crisis. That was Keynes's prescription to cure economies out of recession, out of a crisis. And now whether that would solve a problem of economic inequality is almost like a second order question, so to speak. It may or may not. And it entirely depends upon which country we're talking about. But that's not really the objective of Keynesianism, so to speak. There was another, I think, a continuation of that question.
So the continuation was essentially saying that to repair capitalist damage, which is inequality, Keynesianism was there, something like that.
Uh, it, so to some extent, Keynes was skeptical of the free market profiteering motive, saying that yes, if left completely unregulated, then there would be a danger that the free market would run into excess, and to control that, we need the government. But whether it was really to address inequality, that's not really the first objective, so to speak. The first objective is that left to excesses, yes, there would be profiteering, and that may drive the economic system into some kind of a crisis. And when you're hitting the crisis, at that point of time, you can't expect the free market to do any kind of a resolution. You need the government to step in to take the economy out of the crisis. But inequality is something that is an extremely complicated and challenging problem to solve, and it's not something that has been successfully solved in any country for that matter, with or without Keynesianism. So I would not necessarily attach inequality that strongly with Keynesian policies. But Keynesian policy is essentially about the role that the government can play in order to take an economy out of a crisis and revive growth. So let's go to the next question.
The next question that we have is, was Fabian socialism only one present in Britain, or were there other countries where it was practiced?
So Fabian socialism was largely prevalent in Britain. There was also a lot of socialistic thinking of similar types in France. France even today continues to be a deeply socialistic country. In fact, recently the French premier has been talking about bringing in central planning all over again. So it was in Britain, and socialism in general was prevalent in France as well. But if I think of the countries that won the Second World War, and therefore the whole world was looking up to them to decide what economic systems to follow, these two would be the most important examples, Britain and France. What's the next question? So I'll just take one more and then move on.
Yes, the next question is more contemporary, but it's related to the Keynesian thinking. Was Keynesian thinking responsible for the build-up to the 2008 US housing market collapse?
What Keynesian thinking responsible? I would turn it around and say that what Keynes had predicted, that if you leave free markets completely unregulated, then they would turn into excesses, which is exactly what we saw in 2008. That to a large extent, the housing market and the banking sector in the US were left unregulated. And as a result, they did get into a lot of excess. And there was a huge amount of problem building up in these sectors that had gone unnoticed by the government, by the regulator. And when it all came crashing down, at that point of time, the US policy turned entirely Keynesian, because at that point of time, it was all about the central bank and the government intervening in the economy to fix the problems that had been left by the crisis. So the solution was definitely Keynesian. And in fact, in any crisis today, the solution is almost always Keynesian, because we don't necessarily see a crisis where there is a huge economic problem and the government is just sitting back and saying, I will not do anything. It almost always happens that whenever there is a crisis, it sort of justifies the government becoming bigger and bigger. And that's exactly what we saw in the US. The Federal Reserve balance sheet increased manifold. The US government brought in significant regulations. So almost a repeat of what was happening after the Great Depression. So let's move on. And then if there are other questions that get upvoted, I will take it again after 15 minutes. So moving on to Fabian socialism, for those who are not aware of what Fabian socialism or what Fabian society was, the Fabian Society was a British socialist organization founded in 1884. So that particular form of socialism was exclusively British. The idea was that you use the principles of a democratic framework to gradually transition to socialism instead of a revolutionary overthrow, like let's say communism would do. So communism would have a sudden revolutionary movement and would suddenly transition to communism, whereas Fabian socialism was a more gradual and slow transition towards socialism within a democratic framework. What is extremely important to note is that in the 1945 general election in the British government, in the British Parliament, 229 members of the Fabian Society were elected to the Parliament. And that gives you an idea of how socialistic the whole thinking and the whole ideology was at that point of time in Great Britain. In fact, the Prime Minister who was appointed, Clement Attlee, was deeply influenced by Fabian Society. Likewise, as I just mentioned, another country that was also quite socialist was France. And there, the leader, Jean Monnet, was referred to as the father of Europe. His idea was to create an economic plan that would propel France into the modern age. So he had actually gone one step further from Britain. In Britain, what was happening was that the government was nationalizing industries in order to promote economic growth. In France, Jean Monnet had gone one step further. He had actually created an economic plan in order to propel France into the modern age. And of course, and gradually we can move on to the other extreme of complete central planning that was done by Russia. So this is a picture of the National Coal Board that was set up in 1947 January in Great Britain, when the British new government nationalized the coal industry that was earlier owned by the private sector. So they nationalized the private sector, nationalized the coal industry. As you can see, it's written on the end, towards the end of the board, on behalf of the people. So that was extremely important. That was the dominating ideology of the day, that nationalization was happening in the interest of the people. And all throughout, the idea was that government nationalization, government promoted industries are required to promote economic growth and social justice. So that was the mood prevalent in Great Britain. And of course, Great Britain for us was a very, very important, influential country. Now we come to the most important part of today's talk, which is the experience of central planning in India. Now, India, of course, I'm hoping you can all recognize this is Delhi. India achieved independence in 1947, so it became from the world's largest colony, or the centerpiece of the British Empire. And from there, when it became independent, it became the world's largest democracy. Okay, so it was a massive experiment in democracy, which till now is absolutely stunning, because after all these decades, we have succeeded in retaining democracy in India, which is perhaps the only colonial country which has been able to continue an uninterrupted stint of democracy, except perhaps that 1.5 years of emergency that was declared. So that itself was a huge experiment, which I could consider still a success. Now, of course, as you know, Jawaharlal Nehru became our first prime minister, and he played an extremely important and crucial role in the whole idea of central planning in India. The title of this slide is Tractors and Big Machinery. This was actually something that Nehru had quoted in one of his speeches, that his idea of promoting economic growth in India was through tractors and big machinery. Now, a few salient points to remember here. Post-independence, the most important problem in India was poverty. We were an extremely and deeply poor country. Nehru wanted India to become self-sufficient. In this, of course, he was also largely influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's idea of self-sufficiency, although Gandhi wanted to achieve self-sufficiency through villages, whereas Nehru wanted to do it through industrialization, so completely different. His idea was that heavy industrialization was required to provide what he referred to as the big push, push from a really poor economy to a modern economy. And he was a visionary. He was a dreamer, and he had really big plans and big dreams. His idea was you get rid of the severe poverty through the use of technology, heavy engineering, machines, large industries, and so on and so forth. In fact, when he had gone to Cambridge to study, although he was studying the natural sciences, he was deeply interested in technology in aviation. And that obviously had a role to play to some extent in his whole vision of how Indian economic growth can come about. And the intellectual elite, his idea was that the intellectual elite of the state would plan the development process on behalf of the common people in order to meet the needs of the nation and not of special interests. So, that is very important. The kind of vision that he had was that there would be a bunch of intellectual elite people, the experts, so to speak, the technocrats, the experts, who would plan the development process on behalf of the people of India. And they would decide what the people of India need and how that is going to go about. So the whole thinking was very different at that point of time. A few priorities when, for example, the Constitution was getting written. If you ever read the debates of the Constituent Assembly, they were absolutely fascinating. And even afterwards, Nehru's speeches, etc., it's very clear that there were some well-defined priorities of post-independence India. The first priority and the first important thing, as I said, was India was desperately poor, And it was really short of resources, economic resources, natural resources, and it was short of skills. Secondly, the scarce resources that India had to be invested in building a modern economy. And how was that to be done? It was to be done through industrialization with the singular goal of alleviating poverty. The third important point was that the government must capture and control the commanding heights of the economy. Remember, at the beginning, I had mentioned commanding heights was basically the founding pillar industries of any economy, as Lenin had mentioned. So Nehru also believed exactly the same thing, that government needs to capture and control the commanding heights of the economy. Private capital was inadequate. So government must own all the capital intensive sectors such as steel, cement, fertilizers, etc. And you cannot rely upon the private sector to take the economy out of poverty, because private sector, after all, is all about profit maximization. But when the most important problem of the economy is to get rid of poverty, of course, you have to rely on the government. It was almost like an obvious thing. And lastly, and very importantly, private property could exist. He was not against private property at all, but it must be subordinate to the state in the building of the Indian economy. And the reason I've highlighted the last phrase is that was the most important priority, that you alleviate poverty and you build a modern Indian economy from scratch. And of course, you have to remember that, when you were achieving independence from the British Empire after 200 years of rule, we're absolutely exhausted. There is practically no resource. There is no concept of having middle class Indian that will consume. There is no concept of having a lot of capital, a lot of money, nothing of that sort. You're literally building an economy from scratch. And when confronted with that kind of a gigantic task, what Nehru did was he fell back upon the mood of the age. The mood of the age was to rely on the government, on the state, to build economies, either economies battered in the Second World War or an economy coming out of 200 years of colonial rule. The principle is pretty much very similar. So the leaders, and not just Nehru, majority of the Indian leaders, so the two very important influences that I'll talk about. One is majority of the leaders of post-independence India were educated in Great Britain, and they had spent their formative years in the Edwardian England of early 1900s. So this was around 1910, 1915. Many of these leaders were very deeply influenced by Fabian socialism. In fact, Nehru was molded by the writings of well-known Fabian socialists such as George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, Beatrice Webb. Beatrice Webb was in fact one of the founders of the Fabian Society. And of course, he was deeply influenced by John Maynard Keynes. So this influence on Nehru, as well as many of the intellectual leaders of the post-independence India, coming from the British Fabian socialism, is an extremely important influence that played a role in what happened in India over the next 20 to 30 years. And the second influence on Nehru was he was deeply impressed with the Soviet-style model of central planning. Now, make no mistake, I mean, from a political standpoint, he adopted the parliamentary Westminster style of democracy of Great Britain because he was very troubled with the communist style of politics and what that did to freedom. But from an economic standpoint, he was very deeply impressed with the model of central planning. And of course, in his mind, he's sort of a Fabian socialist to some extent. He knows in Great Britain, around that point of time in 1944-45, the Labour Party has won. Clement Attlee is the Prime Minister. Great Britain is turning socialist. There's a lot of nationalization of industries going on. And of course, then you have Russia, who has won the Second World War and is very successful implementing the central planning model. So that's the kind of influence within which he was operating. In fact, in 1944, when he was still imprisoned in a jail in Great Britain, he wrote in a book that the Soviet Revolution had advanced the human society by a great leap, and it laid the foundation for a new civilization towards which the world would advance. Now, as I said, Russia had won the Second World War and had successfully implemented the central planning model to promote industrialization. Why do I italicize successfully? Because at that point of time, it seemed that the central planning model was a big success because Russia had these gigantic industrial complexes, jobs were getting created, and growth was happening. So it seemed like a successful thing to do. In Russia, the planning committee was known as Gosplan, and this was responsible for drafting and supervising a series of 5-year plans. And this, of course, reflected the thinking of Vladimir Lenin, the original central planning Russian, so to speak, that free markets could be permitted as long as the state retained control of the commanding heights of the economy. So this is a picture of the Gosplan building in Moscow. It's a gigantic building, which basically housed all experts, all technocrats that would work on the 5-year plans of Russia for the next several decades to come. So needless to say, two influences, the Fabian socialism of Great Britain and the communist central planning. And of course, the overall, as somebody said, the mood of the age, everything provided support to the pursuit of state-led model of industrial growth in India. In 1950, the Planning Commission was set up under the chairmanship of Nehru, and the Planning Commission was an extremely well-respected, well-regarded institution at that point of time. This is a picture of the Planning Commission, which of course today has been turned into Niti Aayog, but for the decades of central planning, it was one of the most important institutions in the country. So I'm going to briefly stop here and take some more questions. Anas?
Yes, I'll just roll back to the earlier question because it has been upvoted throughout the conversation. Do you think the earlier adoption of capitalism would have helped us?
I would say yes and no. Of course, if we had adopted capitalism, it could have helped us hypothetically. There's no counterfactual, there is no way of knowing, but maybe we could have adopted capitalism around 1971, 1972. The reason I say that is standing in 1947, and I do have a slide on this, there is no way that Nehru and Patel and all the other intellectual founders of the country would have adopted capitalism, because there was no country at that point of time which was wholeheartedly embracing capitalism. And every international expert who had who advised them to do government planning, central planning, or have government intervention in various aspects of the economy. Secondly, as I said, India was a deeply poor country. And when you have that amount of mass poverty and tremendous amount of human suffering, we had famines and we had all kinds of inequality related problems, etc. There is no way that you would look at the capitalism as a solution, because capitalism by definition is a profit seeking, profit maximization system. Whereas what you have here is you have to deal with poverty, inequality, mass suffering, famine, hunger, malnutrition, etc. So the two don't necessarily meet. And therefore, the only thing at that point of time that Nehru could have done was to adopt socialism and government intervention. Perhaps where he went a little bit overboard was to do central planning. I mean, Britain, for example, was doing nationalization of industries as well, but adopting central planning the way Russia had done, but was perhaps taking it to another extreme. Because central planning essentially means the government is planning every detail of what is going to be produced in the economy. And that is extremely difficult to achieve, because in an economy of millions of people, you can't have that kind of a precision to plan anything. It's bound to fail. And of course, I'm going to talk a lot about why it failed. So maybe that was a bit of an extreme, but as I said, standing where he was standing in 1947, 48, could we have adopted capitalism? I don't think so. Maybe we would have preponed the 1991 reforms by a couple of decades. In 1971, when we won the war against Pakistan, the mood was quite positive. And at that point of time, Indira Gandhi was a prime minister, perhaps could have started to slow down the central planning and the government intervention process and could have gradually gone towards capitalism. But what unfortunately happened was that Indira Gandhi went to the other extreme. She actually started nationalizing more industries, and we turned more socialist than before, in fact, to some extent. And I think that really hurt us very badly. So more than the 50s and 60s, I would say what happened in the 1970s was extremely damaging for us. And then, of course, when Rajiv Gandhi became prime minister, he slowly started some reform steps or the other, but it was mostly ineffective. But, all said and done, the switch or the flip from one system to the other does not happen automatically. Rarely in economics does it happen that a country just decides one fine morning we are going to adopt capitalism. That's not how it works. You need some kind of a shock to the system to wake up and say, maybe what was happening earlier was not working and we need to change things. When we had a financial crisis in 1991, that was the kind of shock that switched the system towards a more market economy, a less centrally planned economy, so to speak. But without that, on its own, I think in practical terms, it would have been very difficult. And at all points of time, you have to remember that we have political compulsions. It's not easy for a politician to take everybody along and say, I'm just going to switch the system. So while in principle, we may have benefited with a little bit of an earlier adoption, but I don't think it was feasible at all. And I'll have an even more nuanced response to this towards the end of the presentation. Next question.
Thank you. The next question that we have is, how do you think India can manage to have gains like a capitalist economy while being welfare oriented like socialism preaches?
I don't think that is possible at all. And I think that is why we have all the problems that we have today. We are trying to be a mixed economy. It's sort of a really strange cocktail that we are trying to cook up. We try to have a welfare state. We also try to have subsidies for all the poor people, but we also try to do free markets. There is a way, of course. I mean, Great Britain is an excellent example. They do have a large welfare state, but they're also a largely capitalist economy. So it's not impossible. Of course, it's possible, but we have not succeeded in achieving it. And once again, I will talk about it towards the end. Next question.
The next question is that in the case of such a diverse country like India, how can we start shifting from a centralized model to a decentralized planning? Decentralized planning, the word planning is used there, decentralized planning. How do we make that transition?
So as you all know that, in some sense, we did make the switch in 1991 when we had the financial crisis. We did adopt a lot of reforms to decentralize, deregulate, etc. So that was the moment of switch. The so-called dream budget was presented by the Narasimha Rao team of Manmohan Singh and Chidambaram and Rangarajan and all of them. So of course, there was a grand switch that happened, so it's possible, but what it took was a huge and a severe financial crisis. And of course, we are still struggling to understand and interpret what that switch means for us. And so let me continue. I'm going to take more questions later, but let me continue because I can see where the questions are going, and that will also help me focus on some of the points that I already have in the presentation. Okay, so going back to where I was, the Planning Commission was set up in the 1950s, and the Congress party leaders, of course, the Congress party was the most important political party at that point of time, they intrinsically distrusted the market, and that was very important too. They thought competition was bad. They had a contempt for the price mechanism, and they believed in central planning. They believed in strong state control. They believed that government would do a better job of allocating resources and deciding output compared to, say, millions of individual decision makers, as happens in a free market economy. And they believed that bureaucratic diktats, bureaucratic orders would work better than the price mechanism. They just did not believe in the mechanism of prices at all. So of course, that deep contempt for the price mechanism, the deep skepticism about the market and the private sector, of course, had a big role to play in sort of entrenching socialistic ideals in our collective mindset as a country. So this is a quote from one of the government bureaucrats of the time: scarce resources had to be directed. Otherwise, they might be frittered away producing non-essentials such as lipsticks. And the idea was that the poverty and the human suffering was so massive, so tremendous at that point of time, that development had to happen urgently. We could not afford to wait for the private sector to come around to produce what was required. And as a result, the government had to step in to direct the scarce resources towards industrialization, towards central planning. Of course, one cannot talk about central planning in India without talking about the chief architect of central planning. While Nehru was the sort of the philosopher who had dreamt about central planning, the person who made it happen was a brilliant scientist called Prashanto Mahalanobis. He was essentially a scientist. He went to Cambridge like Nehru to study. He first studied physics. Then he studied statistics, and much later in life, he became an economist. So why am I telling you this? Because that gives you an idea of how Mahalanobis approached the whole idea of planning. Okay, he approached it as a quantitative problem. He actually had very complex tables of inputs and outputs, and he had very complex mathematical formula that would link different sectors and enterprises of the country. And the idea was as if that you could plan development of a country with almost the same precision as a physics experiment in a lab. That's almost how you approach the problem. And public sector ownership, central planning was started with great enthusiasm. All of this was, of course, blessed by Nehru. The existing large private industrial empires of, let's say, the Tatas and Birlas were allowed to survive. But the idea was that the state would take charge of all the new ventures. And as a result, we saw a large-scale emergence of public sector or state-owned enterprises in almost every sector of the economy. Power utilities, chemical plants, automobiles, hotels, state-owned banks, everything. And all these state-owned enterprises, they operated in largely protected and sheltered markets with absolutely no competition from the free markets, right? So essentially, you can imagine that in an economy, you have about 200 or 300 large companies or large enterprises who are all operating in a sheltered and protected environment with no competition from any other private sector or no competition from any foreign company. This is a picture of Tata Airline and Air India. So I don't know how many of you know, Air India was originally owned by J.R.D. Tata, who was the father of Ratan Tata, and it was called the Tata Airline. And it was set up in the 1930s, but in 1953, the government of India nationalized Tata Airline, took the Tata Airline from J.R.D. Tata and converted it into Air India. You know, the date on the plane says 1962. 1962 was the year in which the Tata Airline was formally renamed as Air India, became a nationalized airline, and continued to be a monopoly in the aviation space for several decades after that. And of course, as we know today, the kind of problems that Air India has been running into for the last several years, and how much the government has been struggling to privatize Air India all over again. And ironically, Ratan Tata was invited to invest in Air India. So it's almost like a story coming full circle. But this gives you an idea of what was happening. So there's an airline which was actually run by a private sector, by the private Tata empire, Tata family, but then that got nationalized and converted into a monopoly called the Air India. This, of course, is 1969 when Indira Gandhi was the prime minister and she decided to nationalize almost all the banks of the country. Again, another legacy problem that we are suffering from even today. Majority of the problems in the banking sector, if you guys have been reading the news, is primarily because majority of our banks today are still owned by the government. And whenever there is a problem in the banks, it's the taxpayers' money that gets spent. So what was started in 1969, it's still a legacy problem for us. Of course, what central planning did was, with all the grand vision and grand dream of Nehru and all the other intellectual elites of the time, of course, it did not work. It was a complete failure, as you can imagine. I mean, if you're trying to plan an economy with the precision of an experiment with input-output tables and quantitative formula, it's obviously not going to work. And I've obviously created a very sheltered and protected system, but there is no competition whatsoever. So politically, from a social standpoint of view, India continued to be a democracy, which was considered a great achievement of the 20th century. But economically, it was a big failure. You may have heard of this phrase called the Hindu rate of growth, which was just a measly 3%. Now imagine for a country which was that steeped in poverty and unemployment, to have a really miserable rate of growth like 3% is a disaster, because nothing much really happened in the economy after decades of central planning. What ended up happening was that all the state-owned enterprises recorded huge losses. As a result, the government debt went up because the government had to finance all of these enterprises. Investment had to be cut, growth suffered. The debt actually went up more than 80%. Today, as a result of the pandemic, just to give you a perspective, there's a lot of discussion that our debt to GDP ratio will go to more than 80%, and that's an alarming thing. But back then was actually a time when our debt was already more than 80%. So you can imagine how bad the situation was. So the things had come to such a point that in 1991, we had a severe financial crisis because we had borrowed a lot from foreigners, and we did not have enough money to repay them. And we were almost on the stage of defaulting on our external debt. In 1991, P.V. Narasimha Rao became the prime minister. And he said famously that I realized the position was bad, but I did not realize that it was this bad. It was seriously a very severe crisis. And as some of you have been asking, that is what made the switch. Of course, from Rajiv Gandhi onwards, the idea was that central planning or socialism was not working. He had already started on some reforms. But with the crisis of 1991, it was an urgent. In fact, there are very interesting stories that Manmohan Singh was scheduled to go for a lunch meeting with his friends, but he gets a phone call in the morning that he has just been appointed the finance minister. So he had to cancel the lunch with the friends and urgently run to meet Narasimha Rao, who was the prime minister, because everything had to be done in a jiffy. And in just a few weeks, they had to put together the dream budget to take the economy out of that muck that it was stuck in and get the economy into a more deregulated, more privatized space. So that was the crisis switch that played a very important role in turning us from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented economy. This is a graph of GDP, gross domestic product of India. And the only reason I have it here is that if you can see from 1950 to 1970s, it's completely flat. There was practically no improvement in production of national output that was happening. And these were the peak decades of central planning in India, but nothing much was really improving in terms of total product, total output. But of course, when you see from 1990 onwards, there is a very sharp increase in the GDP production. And that's basically when the market-oriented reforms had started getting implemented. So why did central planning fail? I'll just finish this section and then I'll take more questions. Or actually, let me take a few questions and then do the section. The section is a little bit big. So Anas, are there any questions?
Yes, we have a flurry of questions actually.
Okay.
So the first question, I think Harneet
let's do two, three questions, and then we'll come back again.
Okay. So the question asked by Harneet is that, do you believe ideologies of socialism and capitalism are relative to the prevailing conditions in any economy? That no ideology guarantees continuous growth?
Okay, so first of all, you have to remember that the ideology in majority of the cases is highly theoretical. One can say that if you have read about Marxism, ideology-wise, it is a great ideology, and it seems really sensible, it makes sense. But if you try to implement it in practice, it's going to be an utter failure. So ideologies sound and work very well in theory, but when we try to implement them, because when we're implementing them, then we are encountering all kinds of complexities of a real world economy in terms of there are political compulsions, there are lobbying, there are real world problems like poverty and unemployment. Then there is a private sector who wants to make profit. Then there are people who want jobs and want to earn income. There are people who want to spend and consume. So it's a huge amount of complexities in any economy. And no one ideology, and you're right in that, no one ideology can do justice to that, because ideologies are not only theoretical, they also take sometimes a bit of an extreme view of the world. Capitalism will say that, it's just about free market and private capital, and that's exactly what's going to work. Whereas socialism or extreme communism will say that no, the government and the state has to control everything, private property will be secondary. And neither of them is perfect as far as taking an economy forward is concerned. And that is precisely why today you will not see a single economy in the world which has adopted any single ideology. Okay, you don't have 100% communist country. Even Russia and China today are not 100% communist in their economic models, because the whole idea of Soviet Russia completely disintegrated and failed with the collapse of Soviet Russia. Neither do we have a 100% capitalist economy. If you look at the US or UK, they are absolutely not 100% capitalistic. So yes, you are right that no one ideology is successful in taking an economy forward. But then again, the whole idea of having these ideologies is basically you get a framework, and then you choose that how much of which framework you want to mix together and adopt in keeping with the realities of your own country. Next question.
Thank you for that. The next question is sort of a follow-up on the previous question itself. It's like, are mixed economies actually a good idea, or is being on the extreme better?
I think I've already answered the question in my last answer, that there is no country today that is on the extreme. The only country I can think of which is in the extreme is North Korea. It's an extreme model. It's extreme communism. Is it even communism? I don't even know what system they're following. But is that something that we would aspire for? Absolutely not. So we don't really have a country that is in any of the extreme. today. So therefore, there is no example of an extreme country. And hence, all countries to some extent or the other is a mixed economy. State intervention is a reality of life. Having a private sector is a reality of life. The whole question is, when you are in mixed economy, which way will the balance tilt? Does the balance tilt more in favor of the state, or does the balance tilt more in favor of the market? And there is a continuous battle that goes on between the state and the market in every economy. Some economies like the US and UK have succeeded in achieving a framework within which that balance can be resolved. Some economies like India, South Africa, Brazil are still struggling with the framework. And because we just keep going back and forth, and majority of the times in our case, the balance tilts towards the state because we have had a legacy of decades of central planning and socialism. And the socialist mindset is deeply entrenched in our case. So mixed economy, whether good or bad, that's not the question. Mixed economy is the reality because you can't have an extreme. Let's have the next question.
The next question is by Tanay. He asks, the Soviet and Chinese economy have similar aspects of authoritarianism and a government-owned economy. Why is the CPC more economically successful than the Soviets?
Well, there was a time when the Soviets were significantly more successful than any other country in the world. If you look at the central planning peak of the 50s and 60s, the Soviet model of planning was extremely successful. I mean, they, as I said, they did large industrialization, they generated a lot of jobs. But the problem is, what was going on in Russia was that they had completely subjugated private sector and private property. And when you do that, beyond a point of time, there is no incentive, there is no initiative, there is no entrepreneurship. And as a result, the pie does not grow. You know, imagine you have a pizza and all you want is, you care about equitability and you care about dealing with inequality, but you're slicing the pizza and giving the pieces to multiple people. But if the population is growing, the size of the pizza needs to grow. Otherwise, you're stuck. That's exactly what happened with Soviet Russia, that at some point of time, the pie was not growing. And as a result, they had massive famines, they had hunger, they had poverty, and the whole model just failed apart. What went on in China was, China was in a similar situation till about 1960s, 70s, when, I don't know whether you guys have heard the name of this Chinese visionary called Deng Xiaoping. He ushered in a huge amount of reforms in Chinese economy. In a way, Deng Xiaoping, he ushered in for China what we did in India in 1991, except he did about 3 decades earlier. And he ushered in a lot of market-oriented reforms, a lot of privatization, and that sort of triggered China's growth story from then itself. And if you remember, this was also simultaneous with the East Asian success story of South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, etc., all of whom were becoming external-oriented, private-oriented. And China sort of latched onto the bandwagon to some extent, and then continued a steady increase from then onwards. So China has, until recently, has actually been a sort of a successful combination of a state-oriented market economy. Okay, so it's kind of a economy where the state plays a very important role, but the private sector and the market economy is also given a lot of importance. Of course, recently with the current Chinese premier, things have gone a little bit more towards one extreme, towards state intervention. But that's what separates China from Russia. Russia never really managed to get into this private sector come state combination. In fact, in Russia, the corruption is extremely high because you have large oligarchs who own oil companies, for example, and there's a huge amount of corruption and nexus between the government and the private sector. So they never really managed to go to the next level because they never did the kind of reforms that either China or India did. So I'll take one more question and then move on.
Yes, the next question is, but don't you think privatization of banks would shift the motive from helping the underprivileged to profit optimization?
I could do a one full session on this. The job of a bank is not to help the poor. A bank is a business. A bank is not a social charity. A bank is where you as a depositor keep your money so that you get your interest payment. And a bank is a place where you go to take a loan so that you pay the bank interest. And that's how the bank makes money, between the margin that it gets from the depositor and the margin that it takes from the lender. That's a business motive, and that's what a bank is. A bank, end of the day, is a business. If the bank is not a business, then if you put your money in the bank, one fine day the bank may just tell you, sorry, we cannot pay you your deposit because we have just been busy helping the poor. Will that be fine with you? I would think not. So My answer to that, what I'm trying to say is that a bank is also a business. You know, a bank is not a department of the government which will do a subsidized program for the poor people. And that's the thing that we completely fail to recognize in India. We have somehow come to a situation where we consider banks as organizations that will help the poor. That is absolutely not what a bank is for. So I'm going to move on in the interest of time. So why did central planning fail? Three self-defeating characteristics of the central planning model of India, and this applies to any central planning anywhere in the world. One, of course, we had replaced British Raj with Permit Raj. It was a complex system of controls and licenses that dominated every step in production process. To give you some examples, if a businessman wanted to shift from making plastic shovels to plastic buckets, he had to get approval from the government. He did not have the freedom to decide what he wanted to produce at what point of time. If he wanted to increase production from, say, 1,000 buckets a month to 1,500 buckets a month, he had to get an approval. As Narayan Murthy, the founder of Infosys, says, it used to take us about 12 to 24 months and 50 visits to Delhi to get a license to import a computer worth $1,500. You can imagine how cumbersome and tedious the process was, that to get any kind of work done, you essentially had to loiter around the corridors of the different ministries in Delhi. And of course, it's inevitable that when it was impossible to work with the system, people learned to work around it. Okay, every license, every permit had to be was procured by corrupt means. If you have watched the movie Guru, which is about Dhirubhai Ambani and how he set up his large empire, you'll get a very good idea about how cumbersome the system was and how businessmen like him had to work around it. And what, of course, we consider as corruption was inevitable for them to make their business profit from. So that's how difficult, that's how complicated the government had made the system. And of course, the bureaucrats loved it because they got all the power. Powerful industrialists would wait in the corridors in order to meet them to get one license. And they would be told to keep coming back every week, every month, just to get one license to, let's say, import one computer. So that's how stifling the system was. Second was there was a strong bias, of course, towards state ownership. Just some numbers, public sector, the whole size of government rose from 8% of GDP in 1960 to more than 25% in 1991. That's a really big size of the public sector. The government owned 240 enterprises. This is excluding railways and other utilities like power and water, etc. 240 may not seem like a big number to you, but you have to remember in a centrally planned economy, you actually don't have a large number of companies. You have a small number of very, very big companies. And all of them were owned by the government. By the end of 1990, 70% of the jobs in the organized economy were in the state-owned enterprises. And what is remarkable is that half of the 240 enterprises owned by the government were actually financially bankrupt. But even if the companies had become sick, that was the term at that point of time, sick companies, even then the government just carried them along and kept running them because that's just what governments do. You know, you don't liquidate bankrupt companies because people may lose jobs. So instead, government would continue the burden of sick companies and continue to pay the employees, even if that meant the government debt shot through the roof. A very fascinating story, and I find this really interesting. There was a company called Hindustan Fertilizer Corporation, that actually still exists. It was set up in 1978, of course, 100% owned by the government. In 1991, it had 1,200 employees who were clocking in every day. But interestingly, the plant had not produced any fertilizer for sale in all the years that it had been in existence. And why was the case? Because the machines that were used in this corporation were bought very cheaply from countries like Germany and Poland and a host of other Western European countries by civil servants. And of course, civil servants don't know anything about buying machines to produce fertilizers, but that was their job entrusted to them. So they thought they had struck a very cheap deal. They got the machines for cheap from these countries, but what was found was that the machines did not fit together. So everybody just pretended that it was operating and went about their daily work. Everybody would come to the work, they would drink their chai, they would read the newspaper, they would get the monthly salary, and they would go back. But in all these years, the company had not produced any fertilizer that was worth selling. That is a classic example of a sick company under the Indian government during the decades of central planning. And you can imagine the huge amount of resources, labor, capital, etc., that was getting wasted in all these 6 state-owned companies. The third self-defeating characteristic, of course, was import substitution. It was a rejection of international commerce through and through because there was a lot of skepticism about exports. And the idea was that you cannot export your goods because you need to keep all the goods for domestic consumption. And you also cannot import foreign goods because that would be competition for our domestic producers. So to protect our own manufacturing industry, we shut out foreign imports. But what that meant was that we excluded ourselves from the world economy. Ironically, at that point of time, we had a large cadre of very talented and smart scientists and engineers, because if you remember, Nehru had actually set up the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology was set up by him. So we had a very large cadre of talented and smart scientists and engineers, but they didn't really get to use the new technologies because we had shut down international commerce, foreign trade, foreign investment, all avenues through which we could have benefited from new technologies that were used in the rest of the world. So we basically became technologically retarded despite having talented scientists and engineers, engineer graduates from our colleges. And technology was frozen at the same level as the 1950s. The classic example, of course, was the Ambassador, which was produced in 1960s, modeled after the British Austin car of 1960s. But even in 1990s, the technology used was the same. And I know in my childhood, Ambassador was almost like a pride to own an Ambassador. But of course, that was not really good for the economy at all. And recently, the production of Ambassador has stopped, thankfully. Of course, the politicians profited from corruption, as I said. Bureaucrats enjoyed the power. And the workers liked the sheltered markets, the businesses liked the sheltered markets, because the businesses did not have to compete with foreigners or any other competitors. But because of the protected market, people were given shoddy goods and services. The system did not respond to customers. People had to wait for 15 years to buy a car. Imagine, today buying a car is extremely easy. You just walk into a showroom, you select a car, you figure out some car loan if you may have to, and you buy a car. But back then, you had to wait for more than 10 years to buy a car. That's how jammed up the system was. Another very important point here. In 1960s and 70s, many Indians emigrated to the US and Western Europe, and they flourished. I mean, be it in the motel business of the US or be it in the retail business in the UK, Indians were flourishing in businesses everywhere. Why were Indians such a success outside India? And I would like to say that, it couldn't be the drinking water. It's not that the drinking water of the US and UK made them flourish. It had to be the economic system under which these NRIs flourished. And of course, that was a highlight of our failure of the central planning system. So what happens is in a central planning, the intrinsic flaw, very nicely summarized by Manmohan Singh, is that if you have a controlled economy which is cut off from the rest of the world by infinite protection, nobody has any incentive to increase productivity or to bring new ideas. And today it is almost common sense to us that if you work in a company, the company makes profit, we have an incentive to work more because we get bonuses, we get some kind of a financial perk, and we try to bring in new ideas, we think out of the box. But back then, that entire incentive, that entire motivation was not there. So instead of that big push through industrialization, as Nehru had dreamt of, we had developed a very complex and cumbersome system of quotas and tariffs and permits and controls, which would completely stifle incentive, initiative, and entrepreneurship. Okay, so this is where the private market or the private sector, the free market, plays a very important role, because the free market gives you the freedom to basically be an entrepreneur. Today, if you look around in India, there are so many young people who have come up as entrepreneurs in the digital economy or in the IT sector. But imagine that you're in a centrally planned country where that is not allowed. And you just have a job where your salary is guaranteed. You go, you work, you come back. There is absolutely no initiative to do anything better. And that's exactly what was happening in the Indian economy during central planning. This refers to the question that was asked earlier: could we have adopted capitalism earlier? So was there an alternative back then? My answer is none that Nehru and the intellectual elites around him could readily see. As I kept saying, India's economic problems were enormous. We were extremely poor. There was no capital market. And the private sector did not, other than Birlas and Tatas and maybe Ambanis later on, there was not really much of a capital market in the private sector. There was no middle class. And we had urgent problems that we had to solve, so we could not wait. So Jairam Ramesh, a Congress person, said that we tried to implant a Soviet economic model on a Western parliamentary system on an Indian social system. You know, we also had to deal with caste problems, inequality problems, etc. It was a heady cocktail. So before I move on to the next section, I'll just take a few questions, and I will spill over a little bit beyond 7 o'clock.
Sure. Should I ask you the next question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, the next question is more into the ideological aspects. And what is your view on impact or social capitalism that is based on the idea of diverting financial resources through a capitalist setup for social benefit?
My view would be that if the capitalists themselves want to do that on their own, then absolutely, they should be free to do so. It's their choice where they want to employ those resources and how they want to deploy those. That's completely should be left to their choice. It should not be dictated by the government that a certain capitalist has to employ a certain amount of money for social purposes. To the extent that we still have problems of poverty and inequality, of course, the government has to step in with, let's say, subsidized welfare programs, but that should be a very limited ambit of the government intervention, which is called redistribution of resources. But if the capitalist system, if the capitalists of the country want to do that, it should be completely left to their choice. It should not be mandated by the government. Next question.
Yes. The next question that we have is, what trajectory should India's monetary and fiscal policy follow now? Can we take clues from the Austrian business cycle theory, or would it be futile in practice?
Since that is not completely relevant to what I'm saying now, can we just park it for now? And if I have time in the end, I'll answer this.
I'll also request participants not to annotate on the screen. You're requested not to annotate on the screen.
Yeah, I don't know why that's going on. That's a bit disturbing.
Shall we go to the next question?
Yes, please.
So there's a question that asks about the difference between socialism and Fabian socialism, if there is any difference in that context.
So in some sense, socialism can also be a very drastic transition to an increased role of the government and the state. And in an extreme form, as I said, socialism can even become like communism, where you just overthrow a current system and impose the rule, impose the power and intervention of the state. Whereas Fabian socialism, the main feature that distinguishes it from this is basically the idea that it's socialism within a democratic framework, and you have a very gradual and slow transition towards an increased role of the government and the state. You don't do anything sudden, and you definitely don't do it outside the democratic framework. So two main features are it's socialism within a democratic framework, and it's a very gradual and slow transition to socialism. Next question.
We have another question on the bank part. Would you like to take that question? I think that has been going on in the conversation.
Sure.
Doesn't the nationalization of banks help the poor agriculturists and other economically backward people, since the capitalist structure is more income oriented?
So there is something called a priority sector lending that every Indian bank has to abide by. It is a regulation that had been started since the day of nationalization, that 40% of the... Can everybody please put their microphones on?
Can we have your microphones muted, please? Thank you.
Yeah, so there was a regulation, there is still a regulation that all Indian banks have to spend 40% of their liabilities in priority sector lending, and they would have to lend to agriculture, which is one of the priority sectors, and many other sectors identified by the government, and that is, of course, in place. My views on this are a bit mixed. As I said, end of the day, banking is a business, and if you want to extend credit to the agriculturists, that there has to be specialized banks or specialized institutions to do so, which are not looking to be a banking business. And maybe the government can extend agricultural credit through other finance, specialized finance institutions. But should banks necessarily use their resources to give loans. So to the extent an agriculturist can come to the banking system and ask for the loan the way you and I could, of course, he would be eligible or she would be eligible. But to the extent that agriculturists are from a part of an informal economy that they're not able to do so, maybe there can be specialized institutions or the government can set up some kind of a system to extend credit to them. I'm not sure that all banks, all commercial banks should be made to do this, which is currently the mandate that every bank has to do agricultural sector lending. So anything that happens by mandate becomes a bit problematic because again, that takes away the incentive and the initiative that I was talking about.
Thank you. Should I ask you the next question?
Yes, yes.
The next question that we have is that in what way was India a mixed economy when it was mainly influenced by the ideals of socialism? Can we say that the failure of central planning was a failure of mixed economy and not of socialism?
Um, first of all, it's not a past tense. You are currently living in a mixed economy. India today is a mixed economy, and we will continue to be a mixed economy definitely during our and your lifetimes. Um, India was less of a mixed economy in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was more a centrally planned economy, although we would like to think it was a mixed economy because there was some semblance of private sector. Of course, as you saw, the Narayan Murthy was operating, Dhirubhai Ambani, the Ambani Empire was there, the Tatas were there, the Birlas were there, and there were private sector, there were private industrial companies as well. To that extent, because it was a sort of coexistence of government-owned, state-owned enterprises and private sector, we would like to think at that point of time it was a mixed economy. But for all practical purposes, it was a largely centrally planned economy. It is actually today more of a mixed economy. So the failure was more a failure of central planning. What we are seeing today is a mixed economy where we have a large enough private sector and we have a large enough public sector. And that is actually much more of a mixed economy than it was in the 60s and 70s. So unless there are questions which are getting upvoted, Anas, can I just move on to this section?
Yes, yes, or you can move on.
Okay, okay. So now I'll come to this really interesting part, which is quite brief, but I want it to be quite thought-provoking for you all, which is modern day central planning in India. Now this slide is basically, it shows you that Coca-Cola, which of course we all know Coca-Cola, in the 1970s, all international companies were driven out of the country by the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. But in 1990s, when we started the reforms, Coca-Cola made a comeback, and it was very happy to come back along with many other international companies, and that's why it put up billboards saying happy to be here. Of course, in 1990s, when we were hit by the financial crisis, we did a lot of privatization, liberalization, deregulation reforms. The goal was to get rid of central planning because clearly it had not worked. It had not delivered any result whatsoever other than a whole host of 6 companies. And the idea was to become a market-oriented economy. And of course, because we are always influenced by what was happening in the world, just as we were influenced by what was happening in Great Britain and Russia in the 1940s and 50s, by 70s and 80s, the Southeast Asian economies had started becoming, they were called the tigers, the economic miracles. You look at South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, they had become massively successful economies by doing exactly the opposite of what we were doing. And the one economy that we had followed, Russia, had completely failed economically. So, of course, we realized there was something very wrong in our intellectual thinking as well. All these South Asian countries were external oriented, they were exporting, they had very big private sector, they were market oriented. So that's exactly what we wanted to do. And we had to, because in 1991 crisis, when we went to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for emergency loan, some of the conditions that the IMF imposed on us was to basically open up our economy to foreign investment and to privatize and deregulate the economy. So we didn't really have any option because we had become completely broke. Now, when the thought that I want to leave you guys with, and I still have some more slides to go, although, is that how liberalized, privatized, and deregulated do you think Indian economy is as of 2020? And I'm not going to give you the answer to that, but I want you guys to think about it, not just today, but as you go forward, as you read news, articles, books, etc., just to think about how much have we achieved in that goal of liberalization, privatization, and deregulation in all these years. What we ended up doing was that we, of course, got rid of central planning in the sense we abolished 5-year plans. Today, we don't even have a planning commission. But we replaced the government departments that were doing the job of planning with a bunch of government regulators. Today, whichever sector of the economy you look at, you have a whole bunch of regulators, and I've given an alphabet soup of their names. You have the Reserve Bank of India, you have SEBI, you have the pension regulator, PFRDA, the insurance regulator, IRDAI, the airport authorities, AI, the telecom regulatory, TRAI, etc., etc. Now, regulators are nothing but they are government-controlled, government-owned organizations that are regulating the private sector. There's nothing wrong with that per se, because as I said, private sector left to itself can also run into excesses, as mentioned by Keynes. But our regulators have immense power, authority, and control over every aspect of the economy. Okay, so this is basic public choice theory, that when you give any arm of government any power, the power only keeps expanding. Second, of course, is government ownership. As I said, 70% of the banks are owned by the government, and that has been creating a whole lot of problems. Most of the public sector banks are not doing well. They don't have the necessary capital. The government does not have the money, so it's a complete mess. And as a result, the banks have not been lending. You're talking about agricultural credit and whether banks should help the poor people. Forget the poor people in the agriculture. The banks are not lending even to the rich people, and the banks are not lending to anyone. Today the bank credit growth is close to 5.5%, which is the lowest bank credit growth in 60 years. Okay, so it's not that by having 70% banks owned by the government has helped us in any way. And of course, government doesn't just own banks; it owns insurance companies, pension funds, power plants, oil companies, everything. Government control and planning also continues. Today, private fintech companies, you guys are more users of financial technology because you are the new age people. You use Google Pay or Paytm or Phone Pay or whatever it is. All fintech companies are forced to go through a single payments interface called the United Payments Interface, which is owned and controlled by the government through the National Payments Corporation of India, which means the government decides the standard, decides the technology, and that is no different from central planning. Some more examples: the government decides how e-commerce firms like Flipkart and Amazon will do business in India. Last year, the government came out with a lot of rules and regulations. Government mandates, somebody mentioned about this. Government does mandate that companies will spend 2% of their earnings on corporate social responsibility. Now, as I said, I just don't really see why that is necessary. If the companies want to do that by themselves, they'll do it. And the problem of mandating is, some companies will do things like growing one tree or basically figuring out ways of circumventing this 2%. So the moment you mandate something, the tendency of the people will be, how can I circumvent it? Because it's not really helping my end objective. Also examples: trading on our stock exchange is mandated to happen only during the Indian daytime as opposed to round the clock, which is what happens in most of the developed countries. And that hurts us in a big way, because otherwise we could have benefited from round the clock traders sitting all over the world. Agricultural sector was one sector that is subjected to plethora of controls. There are controls on how much land a farmer can own. You and I cannot buy agricultural land, and there's a whole host of problems there. And recently, as you may be following the news, that because the price of onions has gone up, government has banned the export of onions. That's a typo, it will be export of onions. And that affects the farmers, because farmers want to export onions because they get a better market there. But that's something that the government has banned. In 2013, there was a rule that came out that the regulator, the airport authorities, the regulator will basically issue new rules on the hiring of expat pilots, that for every expat pilot, any domestic airline will have to hire 2 unemployed commercial pilot license holders, 2 domestic pilot essentially. Once again, it has to be the airline's discretion to decide whether it wants to have 1 or 2 expat pilots or only domestic pilot. The government cannot mandate and intervene in the business of a private company. So the reason I'm giving all these examples to basically show you that although we did lip service to privatization, liberalization reforms, what we actually did was we got rid of central planning, we got rid of 5-year plans, we removed licenses and permits, and we thought we are entering into a market economy. We fundamentally did not understand what it means to have a deregulated economy, what it means. There was an intellectual framework to understand how does a private sector and the government coexist in a true mixed economy. And as a result, since 1991, once again, the balance has tilted much more in favor of the government. And every step of the way, if you talk to any private sector businessman, there's a lot of obstacles that the person has to face in order to do business in India. And intrinsically, our mindset is that Private sector is corrupt, private sector makes profit, which is a bad thing, and therefore something must be done to punish the private sector. But once you graduate, majority of you, I would assume, would want a job in the private sector simply because the salaries are more and the perks are better and the benefits are better. Very few of you, unless you're given a civil service exam, for example, you would not want to work in a public sector company where things may not work very well. Or even without that example, if you don't have a vibrant private sector, the whole idea of India's growth story falls apart if that does not exist. So I will not take any questions now because let me just finish this and then I will take questions in the end because we're already at 7 o'clock. So the last part is then what should be the role of the state? You know, you guys must be wondering that you have the state, you have the private sector. What really should be the role of the state? Of course, it cannot be anarchy like a country like Afghanistan where practically nothing works, or an extreme country like North Korea where I don't really know what happens. Nobody knows because there's no newspaper. We cannot have central planning like Soviet Russia. Clearly, that has not worked. It failed completely. So what is a framework through which we can stay on the middle road? And by the middle road, I mean the mixed economy, something that US and UK and Germany, etc., have managed to achieve. And here's some of the key concepts, but each concept takes a full session. So I'll just give a very, very brief idea. The key concepts are market failure, public choice theory, and state capacity. Okay, so we do not want the state to control the means of production. I think that's pretty much clear after our decades of bad experience with central planning, that we don't want the state to control means of production. Even today, majority of the state-owned enterprises in power, oil, etc., are loss-making companies. So then the role of the state boils down to two things. One is a Keynesian fiscal policy, that when there is a crisis, when there is a recession, the government needs to spend to generate demand and to generate jobs. And the second is state intervention based on market failure. And in most areas, the best strategy for the government is to not interfere. And we need to get used to the idea that it is actually good for the government to not interfere. But unfortunately, as citizens of India, our mindset has become that although we know the government does not work well in so many sectors, you know, we do. I mean, how many of you have gone to a public school or gone to a public hospital? And now, because of the pandemic, more people are getting exposed to the absolutely pathetic condition of public hospitals. So there are many, many examples that the government does not work very well in these sectors, and not just health and education, but also in multiple other sectors. You look at aviation, where Air India is a loss-making enterprise, or you look at banks, where there are several problems. But despite that, whenever there is a problem, we look to the government for the answer, because that is our deeply entrenched socialist mindset. That is something that we have inherited from our predecessors. So what is meant by market failure? The free market goes wrong in four cases. One is market power. For example, monopoly, or let's say Reliance Jio today is a giant monopoly, and it is actually basically eating up all the other competitors. And that's not a good thing, because as customers, we want variety. But if there's a monopoly, we get deprived of that. So market power is a market failure. Externalities, whenever a factory pollutes, factory absolutely does not care about pollution, because all it cares about is producing a profit, let's say. But if it pollutes in the process, that is something that adversely affects the people living outside the factory. Third is asymmetric information. This happens a lot in pharmaceutical industry. For example, when you buy a drug, you have no way of knowing what has gone into the drug. I mean, the drug could be adulterated, and that's asymmetric information, because you don't have the information as the buyer, but the producer knows what it's doing. And the fourth, of course, is public goods in terms of safety, defense, roads, etc. Because free market will not get into any of these things, because there is no profit to be made. It is also something that is shared by everybody, and you can't really exclude the other person from using public goods. So in all of these four cases, when free market goes wrong, there is a need for the state to intervene. And the state should set up regulators. The state should be there to prevent monopolies, to prevent externalities, to prevent asymmetric information, and to generate public goods. So the first test when considering that whether the state should be in this particular sector of the economy is that, is there a market failure which requires the state to intervene? And if the answer is no, and if there is no Keynesian fiscal requirement, then there is absolutely no reason why the state should be there. The only exception I will make to this case is redistribution in terms of giving subsidies and transfers to the poor people of the country. But other than that, the state should not be there in all the other examples that I had given earlier. And later on, Anas will circulate a TED talk that I had done, and that will give you more examples of where the state should not be. So this is my last slide. Let's not have illusions about government organizations and agencies, because just because somebody got elected and got to the government doesn't mean that he or she became a different person. They're just people like us, and they are motivated by their own interests, and they are obviously working in order to satisfy some of their own objectives. So the idea is we must focus the limited resource and power of the government upon some few burning priorities. For example, safety, internal crime, law and order, external defense, infrastructure in terms of roads, etc., courts, judiciary, criminal justice system. So all of these things are where you need the government urgently. But if you spread thin the resource of the government into 1,000 things, then just like any individual, the government will not be able to do anything properly. So it's important to focus the limited resource of the state in a few things and let the market, let the private sector do the rest. That's basically what a mixed economy should look like. And that is what happens in mixed economies like UK, US as well, who have this kind of framework for the state to operate in. But the state is not trying to stifle the private sector at every step of the way. Rather, it's trying to encourage businesses and encourage the private sector. I will end with a quote from the Austrian Society. This is by Ludwig von Mises. The forces of the market are just that. They are forces. They are like the wind and the tides. If you want to try to ignore them, you ignore them at your peril. If you find a way of ordering your life which harnesses these forces to benefit society, that's the way to go. Okay, so I'm going to stop with that, and I have time for questions now.
Thank you very much, Rajeshwari. Since we have paucity of time, I'd like to ask one final question, which is like $1 million question in itself.
Sure.
How can we link pro-market capitalist reforms in India with political gains so that it becomes easy to implement these reforms?
So the one way to think about this is ultimately, what does a politician want? I mean, the politician wants votes, and in order for people to vote, people want, what do people want? I mean, people want jobs, people want incomes, people want the economy to grow. The growth of the economy is ultimately in the interest of all politicians. And that's something that we need to understand, that, I mean, there is, of course, a role of subsidies and transfers because they're doing the redistribution and doing the welfare state. But end of the day, if the economy is not growing, as I said, if the pie is not growing, then no politician will win the election. So that's where I think the fusion of the political economy and the market economy sort of happens. And when I talk of growth, as I just gave an example, with our own historical experience, we know that the economy does not grow with central planning, with a government-controlled, government-planned country, a government-planned system. So for that growth to happen, you need the private sector, you need the free market. So if you let that free market be, if you let that private sector be, and we ensure that there is genuine ease of doing business, and then you take care of all the other priorities that you have to, then over a period of time, you emerge towards a situation where the political economy coexists peacefully with the private sector. That's something that we do see in a lot of the developed countries of the world today. In UK, for example, there is a large welfare state, but there is also a large private sector. And that's something that we need to recognize. But what happens is we keep going back and forth in saying that, no, the private sector is becoming too big, or it's becoming too powerful, or it's becoming too unregulated, and we need to control it.
I'm just laughing at that only. Actually, I have a webinar going on, which I have like two
Can you
ECC
please,
points, four
Can we
ECC
please
points.
mute yourself? Thank you. Yes.
Yeah,
Rajeshwari, can
yeah. So what I was saying is that's where the fusion happens. That essentially, see, nothing is going to happen in 1 year or 2 years. And the ultimate problem, of course, is all government has just a 5-year time frame in mind. And if you just try to win elections within 5 years, then you just don't care about these problems. So that's something that has to happen over a period of time. And that's why intellectual thinkers and advisors to the government, and they have to basically keep driving this point home, that end of the day, you want the economy to grow. Jobs have to be created by the private sector. The private sector has infinite capital, and that's where the jobs have to be created. That's where the growth has to happen. That's where GDP gets made. That needs to happen. And then alongside, you do whatever your welfare distribution, welfare state, that has to happen in a poor country. But otherwise, if there is a continuous conflict then you just settle into a low-level equilibrium where the private sector loses confidence, and then as citizens, we end up suffering.
Thank you so much. In fact, we have a record 65 questions and still going on. I think we have paucity of time. I believe the session has been extremely engaging.
Okay, if
Looking
you
at the
want,
number
I
of
mean, I
questions.
don't mind taking a couple of questions, but if it's completely
Wonderful.
impossible, then
So
of course
I'd like
yeah,
to ask a couple of questions
sure,
because
sure. I mean, I
there
have
have been,
time.
yeah, just a minute.
Sure, sure. I mean, it's always important to engage with the young minds because these are very important thoughts and important ideas that I'm talking about.
Yeah, indeed. So the next question that we have is the government leaning towards privatization of the economy and the constant failure of PSUs. How far in the current situation is the government intervention going?
Can
I
anybody
request
please
everyone to
mute?
mute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't understand the question. Can you repeat that again?
So the question is that with the government leaning towards privatization of the economy now and the constant failure of the PSUs have been witnessed, how far in the current situation do you think so the government intervene given the pandemic?
Very good question, actually. In fact, I missed saying this, that, what happens when you have an exceptional shock like a COVID-19 pandemic, it's almost inevitable that the role of the government in our daily lives increases by leaps and bounds. In fact, today we are living in a country where, in a situation rather, where every aspect of our life is getting decided by the government, where we can, when, at what point of time we can step out, can we go to a hotel, can we go to a movie hall, can we go to a restaurant, can we send our kids to school, everything is getting decided. I mean, the whole reason we are doing a virtual talk is pretty much also because of that. So, of course, when you have such an exceptional situation, the government role in lives becomes significantly high. And there is no other way. Of course, the private sector is just one company or a bunch of companies who are not going to be able to rise up to the occasion and do anything to manage the situation because this is a national crisis. And just like natural disasters or any kind of other national crisis, the government has to play a role. But the fear that I have is once, it's basic public choice theory again, that once the government or the state, rather in any country, gets so much of power, gets so much of control on people's lives, where do we go from here? Do we go back to privatization? Do we go back to saying that no, we do respect the private sector and the private sector has an important role to play, so let's give them all the freedom and scope? Or do we hold on to this power, hold on to this control that we have on people's lives and become an even bigger government, an even larger government in size? And that's something I actually don't have an answer because we'll all live through it in the next few years. And my only hope is that we do go back to the disinvestment, to the privatization that we were seeing at some point of time, and we do not go back to a situation where the government becomes even bigger and more intrusive, so to speak, in our lives.
Thank you. We have one more question. It says that India is opting for privatization of quite a few public sectors. At this rate, won't private industries take over government in the next few years in a manner that they would create a distortion in democracy?
No, not really, because first of all, no private sector can take over the government. The government has, first of all, the government is big. The government is elected by the citizens of the country in a democracy, and that's where the government gets its power and influence from. And that is an extremely important power that is encoded in the constitution of the country. So no private sector, however powerful that company, that sector can be, can ever take over the government. That's just not a possibility whatsoever. Secondly, the government, of course, plays an enormous amount of role in many sectors of the economy in the country that the private sector can never even get into. As I said, for example, if you talk about internal law and order, the judiciary, the criminal justice system, defense, etc., so on and so forth. So there is no question of the private sector becoming big and taking over the government. In fact, the other way around is more feasible, and that's something that we have lived through, that the government becomes so big that takes over the private sector. But the private sector taking over the government is not something that we should be afraid of, because that's not going to happen. And also, our private sector is not nearly as large as the size of the government, even if I were to humor the idea.
Thank you very much. With your permission, I'd like to also conclude this session.
Sure.
We've had many questions, and I think in the follow-up mail that you'll receive, we'll be sending Rajeshwari's TED Talk and other resources she will be sharing with us. So most of the other questions will be answered, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I'd request Shreyas to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, Anas. Now a feedback form will be circulated. The respective link for it will be put into the chat. ECCs will be given to only those who will be willing to fill the form. Now, as we come towards the end of this wonderful session, we would like to extend our gratitude towards our esteemed speaker, Ms. Rajeshwari Sengupta, for her insights and for making this session a highly encouraging one. Thank you, ma'am. We would also like to thank our principal, Dr. Rajendra Shinde, and our professor, Dr. Saveva Pirani. Special thanks to Team CCS and Commercium Society, without whom this event wouldn't have been possible. And also a big thank you to all our participants for being such an encouraging and a supportive one. Now, may I request all our participants to turn on their videos so that we can have a quick photo. Also, the room will be open for the next 5 minutes, and we look forward to seeing you all again in our future events. Thank you.
And I also want to say thank you so much for all your questions. And I wish there was more time to engage and to answer all your questions. But of course, I can understand that's not feasible. I had a really good time virtually chatting with all of you. And hopefully we'll get such opportunities thanks to CCS again in future. Thank you so much. And stay safe.
Thank you. Shaurya, you can stop the live stream so that we can take the picture.
So Anas, is it okay for me to leave now?
Sure. Would you like to stay for the picture for a moment?
No problem.